Well, good afternoon. I'm Samuel, and we're going to be talking today about empowering iOS developers. So, as a room full of iOS developers, I hope we all want to feel empowered. If not, I'm sorry. So, I work on a team at Square called the Mobile Developer Experience Team. My team is basically responsible for trying to keep all of our mobile developers, both iOS and Android, as happy and productive as possible. And again, as a room full of iOS developers, I think we can all appreciate that being happy and productive at times is rather difficult. So a little bit about me. I've formerly worked on some iOS open source projects. Was a core contributor to both Ruby Gems and Bundler. I worked at Realm for a while. And I'm also a core maintainer of CocoaPods. So if you've ever filed an issue to CocoaPods, you've probably seen a really, really small image of my face there. So if I look familiar, that's probably why. So you may be wondering, okay, that's a lot of random stuff. What do all these things you've done have in common? And it turns out that basically my entire career as a software engineer has been building tools for other developers. Why would you ever do that? Well, it turns out that building tools for people is a lot higher leverage than just building applications. By higher leverage, I mean if I make something 10% better for a developer, I'm making it 10% better for everyone on my team. Multiply that out by the number of people there. That's a lot better than me putting in the work on some shipping code myself. I also get to oftentimes build tools for people who sit right next to me. That can be really fun and rewarding to try and build things for your coworkers, because you can, see the joy in their faces when they get to use it. The downside, of course, is they also know where your desk is, and when things break, they can come and find you. It's also a lot easier to do open source at work and share what you're doing if you're working on tooling for developers instead of, say, building out the super secret sauce pieces of your application. So you might be thinking, what about all this topic has to do with being an iOS developer? So we're going to take a quick detour through some of the history of what it's like to be an iOS developer. If you've been around for a while, this may be, rehashing your entire career. If so, I'm sorry. So before iOS 2, there was no App Store. There were only jailbreak apps. So everyone built an application to turn your screen white to make it a flashlight, because there was no flash on the iPhone at that time. People built some really simple games, and that was about it. And then iOS 2 came out, and the iOS SDK was released, although at the time it was called the iPhone SDK. And we had a few years of people building some small apps, and that was cool because it was the first time we ever had apps in our pocket. But most of these things were built by, small consultancies, agencies, because every company was like, wow, it's 2009, and we clearly need to have a mobile application, even though we sell tractors. We need a mobile app. It was a great time to be an iOS developer because you could make applications for companies that sell tractors. But then iOS 7 came around, and it redesigned everything, and everyone basically rewrote all of their applications. And around that time, apps started to get big. they started to have more features, they started to have more developers, they started to do more stuff. And well, now, and it's surprising to me, but we're as far, now from iOS 7 as iOS 7 was from the first iOS SDK. Well, now we've got like multinational companies that base their entire businesses off of their mobile apps, which is kind of terrifying. This is an area that 10 years ago basically didn't exist, and now we have whole companies making, entire businesses that are based on iPhone and Android apps. So nowadays, the biggest iOS apps are larger than like what many small companies have across all of their engineering disciplines. So if you need some way to visualize that, think of like the Facebook application, or Instagram, or Gmail, or Airbnb, or Uber. And I'd be remiss if I didn't, of course, mention Square. So these are all like truly massive applications. They've got more features in them than you'll ever see. Something I like to joke about is that in the Square app, like we have more features just for debugging our builds internally than a lot of apps have features, period. But it turns out that even though the big apps have gotten really big, small apps have also gotten bigger. And a big part of that is because the expectations of what we need to ship in our iOS apps have grown. So back in the day, you could, put up a table view that was backed by some REST APIs and stick it into, a navigation controller. And if you were lucky, you'd have a designer friend, and they'd give you some pixel-perfect PNGs, and you'd stick that into your application, and you'd ship it. That was it. It was really simple. But nowadays, we're expected to build so much more stuff into our apps. And this is just the list of things you need to sort of get started and ship your first version. You're expected to have these really nice interactive collections of data. Everything's got a scale from like an iPhone 5S up to a nearly 13-inch iPad Pro. It's expected that when you make changes in your app that's reflected immediately across every device that you have. You need to support multitasking on the iPad. Got to have a sweet share extension. You have now to support like the Apple TV remote and the Apple Pencil. Unfortunately, there is yet no Apple Finger that we need to support explicitly. And you're also expected to deal with a whole bunch more features and APIs like state restoration. So as I said, I work on one of these truly massive applications. We've got like 390 plus source files. No, that's not quite right. We have 390 plus different modules in our monorepo. And yes, I know that monorepo means one repo, but we actually have like multiple repos. But we have one main one, and we call it our monorepo. So we have all these modules. Some of them have hundreds of source files in them. And then we've got, hundreds of test suites for those hundreds of modules. And of course, it isn't actually one application that we have, it's 6 of them. And for business reasons, we basically build on top of this common platform all this shared code and ship 6 apps that include, all of these features and also a couple of SDKs, and all out of the same repo. And so to build this, we have multiple engineering teams, which are, split across a half dozen different offices across the world, and that spans a bunch of different organizations internally in the company. And each one of those engineering teams has their own product manager and designer and engineering manager. And a good, let's say 90% of those teams are responsible for shipping features. Building out new screens and new functionality, the sort of stuff that maybe you'd write a press release about when you're done working on it. I'm in the other 10%. I ship features to everyone else on our team. So server engineers hit this kind of scale a long time ago. And it turns out they had a solution for it. And it's a discipline called platform engineering, which is really just a fancy way of saying there's a mix of doing sort of DevOps stuff and writing frameworks for people. So it's kind of a combination of keeping stuff shipping and abstracting away as much of the boring code we write as possible. Like, think of all the setup required to make a new view controller, and especially if you have a set of like common UI widgets, pulling those in. That can be a lot of code, and when you have hundreds of screens in your application, that starts to become a burden. So getting to this point on mobile took longer. Getting to the point of needing this discipline took longer because it took us longer to get to the same size. It also turns out that mobile platforms have much more first-party tooling than server platforms ever did. There's this prevailing attitude in the iOS community of, well, all we need is what Apple gives us, because Apple gives us a lot. They give us Xcode and the iOS simulators and App Store Connect and the fact that we need to quit iTunes every time we install a new Xcode version. But that attitude was kind of true back in the day, but it's certainly not true now. Apple tools aren't built to handle the scale that engineering organizations like Square have gotten to, because there are problems that Apple's tools just aren't trying to solve for. So what can we provide? How can we step in to fill that gap for our teammates? Well, step one is to be smart and to not try and reinvent the wheel and look to what server folks started doing to solve these problems a long time ago. Things like setting up a standard developer environment. How many of you have ever used a Ruby gem in developing your iOS application and got an error because you couldn't install Nokogiri? No one? Okay. Maybe it's less of a problem now. But that's like a common complaint you see all the time on Twitter, is being like, hey, I just want to build this iOS app, but instead I can't even install the stuff to get started. How many of you work on an application that has 0 tests? Don't be ashamed. Okay, well, a couple of you are willing to admit it. But, starting to get folks together and write tests for your application. And then, automating those tests and getting them set up to run every time you make a pull request or every time you're about to go and release a new version. And then maybe automating deployment, going from every day cutting a new build and sending that up to test flight instead of waiting for someone on the team to remember that there's a new build and building it locally on their laptop and uploading it to test flight, and then maybe the App Store a week later if they remember. Building out frameworks to try and reduce boilerplate and keep things in the application consistent. This ranges from stuff in the UI, like making sure you have a common way of building buttons so every button in the application looks the same. I'm not kidding about this example, by the way. We had an announcement email a couple of months ago where we very excitedly announced that we had a new button class for everyone to use, and people were super excited about it. This is also frameworks for stuff like persisting data, making network requests, the sort of thing that every application does and you want to keep consistent. And also automating painful tasks, whether they're regenerating screenshots for the App Store, or dealing with localization, or testing accessibility. The big one is kind of different build systems. So Xcode comes bundled in with a build system, and so a lot of us don't think about that. But there are alternative build systems for iOS out there. Facebook has one called Buck. Google has one called Basil. And then there are even some companies that I won't name who have started building their own IDEs for iOS developers. And sort of the goal of all this is allowing engineers to focus on building the product, building the thing it is your company ships to customers. And you want them to be able to focus on that so they can be experts in your application, so they can understand exactly how and why it works the way it does. And make the path from, like, you get a design or you get a PRD from your product manager or designer, and getting that into a built app that's shipping to the App Store as easy and as quick and as cheap as possible. So if you work on a small team or a team of one, this may sound really strange. But, think of all of the small parts of your job as an engineer that you try to ignore because you don't find it enjoyable. Things like updating to a new Xcode version, or keeping the build passing, uploading builds, or investigating Xcode doing something silly, because we all know Xcode does silly stuff every once in a while. Speeding up slow builds. This particularly became something important with Swift, because Swift gave us the power to write source files that took like 20 seconds to compile. Updating network request and response code to keep in sync with, the APIs that the server's returning. Or managing an installation of something like protobufs to deal with that. As you reach a certain team size, it begins to make sense in investing in expertise in these kinds of problems. This goes back to the concept of leverage I was talking about earlier. If you can have one person focus on all of these tasks and become an expert in them, then the 10 or 20 or 50 other people you have on your team don't have to, and they can focus on building the app instead. So there are lessons here for everyone, regardless of the size team you work on. Because it turns out, as iOS engineers, we all kind of have the same set of problems. Some of those problems are just bigger in some teams than in others. So the way I like to approach this is, for every complaint that I see one of my teammates make, and we get a lot of complaints because I have a lot of teammates, I try to see if there's some way that we can invest in finding a permanent fix for whatever's frustrating them. There are a lot of everyday frustrations of being a developer, and they pile up really quickly. If we take a look at one of my all-time favorite XKCD comics, we have our hero who's having a little sword fight during the workday, and the manager's like, hey, get back to work. And then you just respond, oh, my code's compiling, and that's an excuse for doing nothing. But no matter how many engineers you have, these sorts of frustrations are real costs that your team is facing. Time spent wasted either means that you ship fewer features or you hire more engineers to ship the same number of features you have as your goal. Either way, that's real money. So an example of one of those things that gets in the way is this is our build history for one of our sort of master hourly jobs taken a couple of days ago, and there are a lot of red builds in there. And every time that happens, someone has to go and look at why the build has failed. And that's super frustrating. Like, you're in the middle of doing something and you get a notification that says the build's failed, and then you've got to go click on that, and then you've got to scroll down to the bottom of the log, and then of course the failure isn't at the bottom of the log because it's Xcode, and Xcode's not helpful, so you need to scroll up. And then by the time you've figured out why the build is failing, you've forgotten what you were doing, so then you go back to do that, and an hour later the build's failed again, and rinse and repeat, and your whole day is gone. So one of the things my team is working on right now is building tooling to keep master green, whether that's dealing with hunting down and suppressing flaky tests, or dealing with flaky environment issues with the iOS simulator. And in cases where we can't keep master green, it's making it as easy as possible to go and read logs and figure out why things have failed. A couple of weeks ago, one of my teammates came into our Slack channel, and he said, hey, not to be a broken record, but I had to rebuild the same commit 27 times to get a green build last night. Ouch. That's, if the build passed on the 28th try, it probably should have passed on the first try, too. And now we're actually working on a project to track every test result and be able to ignore known flaky tests so developers don't have to press that rebuild button 27 times to be able to merge their changes. This also speaks to the lack of faith that people have in the state of our tooling right now. If they see a failure 10 times and their reaction is, even though this has failed 10 times, I still think it's not my fault, so I'm going to try an 11th time. A project I worked on a couple months ago was called Refinement, and it was a tool to do what we called selective test execution. So as I was saying, we have 390 modules and probably something like 500 test suites in our repo. And running all of those test suites takes a lot of time. So, I built a tool that can go and look at your Git diff and be like, oh, hey, you haven't changed this thing in this PR. We don't need to run its tests because you can't have broken them. And, that's helped us avoid some of our flaky test issues, and it's made builds faster. One of my friends came back and gave us a rare compliment after he was on vacation. I was on vacation for a bit and came back this week and noticed that my builds were super fast. Sometimes I'd see some builds take 30 to 45 minutes, but have noticed them go down to about 5 minutes. Just want to say how awesome that is. Seeing the reduced build times have made me nurse PRs with less time, and I presume freeing resources for other folks. It felt super good to get this compliment because we don't get many compliments. But optimizing the PR build pipeline has meant that members of the team could submit new PRs and get them merged faster with less risk of running into a flaky test or running into a merge conflict. And in the amount of time before that it would take this engineer to land one change, now he can land 2 changes. So my most recent project that I was working on this morning has been starting an investigation into adopting Bazel for our iOS builds. Bazel is Google's, flexible, scalable build system. And because it's built by Google, it is, of course, built for scale. So this is definitely towards the big team type of solution. But other companies at Square's size have already paved the way towards adopting Bazel for iOS. What's motivating us to look into this is we'd like to move to a build system that has better parallelism, caching, and finer grain control of our targets than Xcode supports. But this kind of migration takes a lot of effort and requires building up lots of specialized knowledge. So just like you wouldn't ask a Java server engineer to build up table views in your iOS app, it'd be a mistake to go and ask any iOS developer, go and replace your build system. Projects like this and like some of the other projects I've mentioned require a combination of ownership and expertise. You need people to own the technologies and processes you're putting into place and to maintain them. And ideally, they'll have the expertise to understand how all of these pieces can fit together into your technology strategy. So at Square, we have a platform engineering team of over 100 people for server stuff. Our mobile developer experience team is roughly 5 people on iOS and 5 people on Android. Funnily enough, after I wrote this slide, last week we got reorged into the platform engineering organization. So I guess I'm an actual platform engineer now. But in all seriousness, investing in these areas has allowed Square to start scaling up our mobile applications. What was once a team of 50 total mobile engineers is now over 150. We went from one app to half a dozen applications. The takeaway is, no matter what size team you work on, investing in increased productivity and developer happiness is worth it. It's hard. It takes practice, and you need to build up the muscle memory for doing platform-type work. So if this isn't something that your team is investing in currently, find someone on the team to level up in this area. Whether that's you or someone else, find someone to start looking into taking a platform approach, to making your team move faster. The longer you wait, the harder it becomes. Getting ahead of the problem is easier than waiting until you've got a massive application and it just becomes too hard to, add new features and add new code and, ship new apps. Unfortunately, we waited a while before starting to invest in this area. But now we have 5 people working basically full-time to try and make our iOS team more productive and happier. And we're starting to see these efforts pay off. So, courtesy of this Monday's XKCD, I think it's time for a couple of questions. I think there's someone in the very back who needs a mic.
Hi, it was a great talk, thank you. And I have a question that you have 300 modules, right? And how Square manage Xcode project? Because right now in our team, we always have a problem with the Xcode project because it's hard to maintain, and sometimes it's pretty hard to solve the merge conflict, something like that. So in Square, how you guys solve this problem?
Yeah, so this was a huge problem for us. And our approach has been trying to ask Xcode to do as little work as possible, And so we've taken all of our targets and all of our modules and source files and stuff, and we no longer track them manually in our Xcode project. We use CocoaPods to handle generating projects both locally and on the build server. So there are no merge conflicts in project files. For similar reasons, like we long ago moved away from using Interface Builder to build up UI, because having 10 people touch one massive storyboard is a recipe for never, ever, 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 ever being able to ship changes.
Thank you.
Okay, then let's give a big applause to Samuel.